Welcome, everyone, Your Excellency, colleagues, all. Welcome to today's webinar, A Right to Read Without Being Read, Data Collection and the Scholarly Record. My name is Meg Wacha, and I'm the Scholarly Communications Officer here at the Dag Hammarskjöld Library, the flagship library of the United Nations, located at the UN headquarters in New York. I am also your moderator for today. The right to privacy is a fundamental human right recognized by the United Nations and multiple international and regional human rights instruments. It is an expression of human dignity that applies to all people. But what does this look like in the digital age? The collection and monetization of personal data is not limited to a single sector, and it has expanded into the scholarly publishing ecosystem. Over the course of the next 90 minutes, we are honored to convene a panel of experts to discuss the data privacy of concerns of those who engage with the scholarly record, the implications of data collection, as well as possible responses. But before we begin, a few housekeeping items. Please note that this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the Dag Hammarskjöld Library's website, as well as its YouTube channel. Today's session will be offered in English, and we apologize that the platform does not provide automatic translation. We invite you to turn on captions. Finally, each panelist will have an opportunity to present before we move into a period of questions and answers. Please add your questions into the chat as they come up. My colleagues are watching that space, and we will collect your questions for the end. I'm so happy to report, that while we may not be able to answer all of the questions today, we've seen an incredible level of engagement with this theme, with over 800 registrants. And we will make a note of this as we plan for future events. And so without further ado, it is my great pleasure to introduce Mr. Thanos Giannakopoulos, Chief Librarian of the Dag Hammarskjöld Library and Information Management Section, who will offer opening remarks.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, distinguished guests, colleagues, friends. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this discussion on the timely and crucial topic of data privacy. As enshrined in key United Nations documents like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, data privacy is a fundamental human right intertwined with freedom of access to information and freedom of expression. Successive United Nations resolutions, including Resolution 77/211 of the UN General Assembly issued in 2023, have repeatedly brought the imperative of privacy protection to the forefront amidst the rapid advancement of digital technologies. This resolution clearly calls on member states to uphold privacy rights in both online and offline contexts. It underscores the need to develop legal frameworks and policies that protect these rights against the backdrop of emerging technologies like AI and machine learning and generative AI and so on. The challenge posed by online surveillance, data collection, and biometric information use are specifically highlighted, with the resolution urging states to align their actions with international human rights law. The resolution further emphasizes the creation of gender-responsive policies and the safeguarding of vulnerable groups, including children, from violations of privacy rights. Businesses, too, are called upon to respect privacy rights with advocacy for human rights-based auditing and redress mechanisms for any infringements. Additionally, the emphasis on quality education to foster digital literacy and technical skills, alongside the importance of encryption and anonymity tools, powerfully resonates with the needs of our current digital age. What's more, successive resolutions of the United Nations Human Rights Council also strongly reaffirm the human right to privacy in the digital age. In 2023, in particular, Resolution 54/21 stressed that the privacy rights enjoyed offline must also be fully protected online. It identified the significant challenges that digital technologies can pose, also highlighting issues around surveillance, data collection, and the use of generative AI, all of which have privacy implications. The Council's recommendations are clear. privacy rights must be completely upheld amidst technological advancements, with a particular focus on considering the impacts on vulnerable groups such as women, children, and persons with disabilities. They advocate for the review and adaptation of national legislation as needed to ensure full compliance with international human rights law, especially concerning digital communications and emerging technology. The resolution also stresses the importance of protecting privacy in counterterrorism measures alongside with the ethical use of biometric and facial recognition technologies. It elevates the need for business enterprises to fully respect privacy rights in their operations and for states to regulate the use of surveillance technologies. This resolution also emphasizes the need for gender-responsive policies and the empowerment of women and girls in the digital sphere. It concludes with a loud and clear directive for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights to prepare a comprehensive report on the challenges to privacy rights in our evolving digital context, including recommendations for best practices and safeguards. This is to be published and issued soon. So for libraries, the implications of these resolutions are wide-ranging. As stewards of digital resources and personal data, libraries must adhere to the most stringent privacy protection standards. We must also strive to align policies and practices with both national and international privacy laws, regularly updating them to reflect the rapidly evolving digital landscape. Both these series of resolutions focus on protecting the privacy rights of vulnerable groups, including minorities and underrepresented communities. And that is particularly relevant for libraries that aim to create inclusive and safe digital environments. Libraries' collaboration with business enterprises also brings into sharp focus the need to ensure that these businesses respect privacy rights in all contexts. The role of libraries in promoting digital literacy and skills highlights the importance of equipping our communities with the necessary competencies to safely navigate complex digital spaces. These resolutions provide indeed a broad framework for action. They emphasize the fundamental importance of protecting privacy in digital contexts, which means libraries must always ensure the confidentiality and security of user data. However, challenges undeniably remain. News reports often write of largely unregulated trades of sensitive personal data by data brokerage vendors, including vendors frequently used by libraries and other institutions. This exchange takes place in an environment devoid of regulatory oversight, raising serious concerns about the handling of individual data that includes attributes such as ethnicity, gender, sexual orientation, race, political beliefs, and other sensitive bits of personal information. The privacy rights of library users are under increasing threat in this environment. Commercial service providers may require libraries to collect expansive user data as a condition of service, and cloud library systems may store user information outside the library's control. Mobile access to library services also raises concerns about potential collection of community identity and location data, and the subsequent sharing of such information with third parties without consent. Despite these challenges, libraries and information professionals have a say in determining what personal data to collect, guided by ethical principles and best practices of data management. Libraries must and can negotiate with commercial service providers to ensure user privacy, refuse services that collect excessive data, or limit use of technologies that could compromise fundamental privacy rights. I also don't want to sound naive. The ability of libraries to influence or regulate the data collection practice of commercial, corporate vendors, or government agencies is often constrained. This highlights the need for ongoing vigilance and advocacy on our part to ensure that privacy rights are upheld. Case in point, the huge interest in the topic we noticed when organizing this panel discussion today, and the necessity for continuing and expanding the dialogue on the vital theme of libraries in society. Our collective efforts are vital in shaping a future where privacy rights are respected and protected for all. I look forward to an enlightening and constructive discussion, and thank you very much for your attention. And over to you, Meg.
It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Christine Cooper. Professor Cooper is the Chair in Accounting at the University of Edinburgh, having previously served as the Chair in Accounting at the University of Strathclyde. Her research is broadly concerned with the impact of accounting in our everyday lives, and she joins us today both as an academic who publishes research and as an editor of academic journals. Dr. Cooper has served on multiple editorial boards and currently serves as the joint editor-in-chief of Accountancy, Business, and the Public Interest Journal, as well as the co-editor-in-chief of Critical Perspective on Accounting. Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, and I hand it over to you.
Wow, thank you so much, Megan. And can I just thank the organisers for inviting me to speak? It was actually such a shock and an honour to be invited. So I can't tell you how happy I am to do this. I've been looking at the chat and there are people literally from all over the world. So this is actually making it a little bit more scary for me. So big hello from Scotland. Typically at this time of the year, we start getting dark. So probably by the end of this meeting, you'll notice that it's nearly dark here. That's anyway. So yeah, but I know that some of you are going to be in lots of heat and all different kinds of weathers. But yeah, enough of that. Okay, so I thought I'd start my talk just by unpicking a little bit about the kind of the backstage of the kind of reading that academics do, but also the kind of writing that we do. And I have to say, honestly, I'm like way into my 60s now, and throughout the whole of my academic career, I don't think I've ever met anyone that really understands what academics do outside of academia. So trying to explain this is actually quite complicated. But I'm going to try, just on the kind of level so that we can kind of understand the economic kind of implications of this, as well as the data implications, because the two are very, very linked, because clearly data collection and sale is incredibly profitable. So, okay, so like most UK academics and probably lots of academics around the world, my contract of employment actually involves a proportion of my time that should be allocated to research, some of it for teaching and some of it for other kind of citizenship. And in the UK, lots of universities, the figure for research is 40%. So, almost half my time I actually spend researching. And of course, I'm also encouraged to try to get outside, not just my time, but kind of more funding for my research. And in different academic disciplines, getting more money is more or less important in terms of what you can actually do. But even then, lots of the research funding that we get comes from government. So, and it's definitely true that you can get, like I could apply, and I have done, received research grants from, let's say, professional accounting bodies and so on and so forth. But of course, if a professional body or a private institution is going to give you research funding, it's because they want you to do a certain kind of type of research, which is fair enough. So the fact that most of research in the social sciences is actually funded by government, in some ways gives us a lot of freedom in terms of the things that we can actually research. So yeah, although that system isn't perfect, one of the things that I've been able to relish throughout the whole of my academic career is looking at things that I think are interesting and important. So that's the kind of like the nice side of that. After that, it actually starts to become a little more tricky. And one of the things that I've seen throughout the whole of my academic career is that we now have fairly challenging publication requirements. And you could kind of say, well, that's all well and good because you're receiving so much funding from the state that you should actually kind of show that you're working hard and producing outputs. I mean, that would probably be a whole other debate kind of outside of this kind of like forum. But I think for me and most other academics, what that means is that probably about every year of our lives, we need to get one fairly big international journal publication. And the range of journals that we can actually publish in are actually quite small. So in my field, there are probably 3 or 4 journals that are really interested in my research. There's a few other places that I could also publish. What this means, though, is that in practice, the places where we publish can take our kind of like, I suppose that like, I don't know, our very humanity, our spirits, the things that we're interested in, you know, the kind of the passion that we have for our research. And by publishing in their journals, what they're actually doing is commodifying all of those things that we actually bring to being an academic. So, yeah, so it's not, I suppose it's, yeah, so that's, I suppose, the first big thing I wanted to kind of say is that, and I think in the flyer for this this event, there was a kind of a reminder that probably about 50 more, it's actually now more than 50% of all the academic work that goes on globally is actually now published by only 5 companies. So there's a kind of like an oligopoly situation when it comes to publishing. The other thing that I should say is that, and I'll talk a little bit about this later on, but just while I'm mentioning the big 5 publishers, probably only 1 or 2 of them, they actually have a huge influence on how their journals are actually seen in terms of quality. So in the field of accounting, the field of business and management in the UK, there's a body that actually ranks the journals, and then they mainly rank it by metrics that are actually provided by the very large publishers, which are mainly citation matrices, and this is how the kind of like the quality is judged. And again, that may be a kind of a discussion for another day. But that's kind of, I suppose, the background to, I suppose, the pressure on academics to publish and the very small range of outlets that we can actually publish in, and also that I suppose to be a large publishing company is incredibly profitable. Accounting and finance is my area, and these would be among the most profitable companies throughout the globe. So while I've just said that actually they take our labour, they take the things that we produce, our time is funded mainly by governments, and then they actually put them in their journals. If you have a paper accepted, you have to hand over copyright to the publisher on the whole. And I could talk a little bit more about that at the end, and I know Nick was probably going to have to say a lot about that. And then what happens is the kind of like the things that are accepted are then actually sold back at really high expensive prices to libraries. So it's almost like the state pays for me to do my research and publish things. It goes to a big private big commercial publisher, and then that commercial publisher actually charges a library for the work that I've produced that the state has already paid for. So that, this is like a huge, very complicated industry that really, as I say, takes the kind of the passion of academics, and their expertise throughout the world, and is, making a lot of money from it. Okay, I thought the next step then is just to talk about the publishing process. So I'm actually the editor of a journal that is published by Elsevier, which is one of the big 5 kind of publishing firms. And like I said, I'm kind of like way into my 60s, so I can actually remember a time before we had kind of network computers on our desks, before really the internet became something that was really common. And when I first became an academic, the way that the publishing process would work is that you'd finish your paper, everything, you're completely happy with it. You would take 3 photocopies. You would post it snail mail, probably across the world, to the editor of a journal, who would then, kind of receive it, and then they would, from their 3 copies, they would keep 1 for themselves, and 2 would then be kind of reposted on to reviewers who would also be probably global. And so, yeah, then they would have to sit and wait. And again, they had to take really kind of careful note of everything, because you'd have to remember when the paper was received, and you'd send it to 2 people to kind of blind review the paper, and then you'd have to kind of chase them if they didn't provide a review. All of this was done by kind of like mail, and it was very, very cumbersome and kind of complicated. And with different journals, like it's not just you get a kind of reviewer's comments and then you'd have, like, the editor would receive them back, then they would have to make a decision, then they would have to post those comments to the author, and this could actually happen 4 or 5 times. So the amount of kind of labor and just sheer paper and, you know, work involved was actually kind of huge. And so very shortly after I became an editor of CPA, we had an editorial system. And honestly, it's, in terms of time saving and monitoring where papers are and keeping track of which reviewers you've asked to review, I mean, honestly, this system is, you know, it was like a godsend, completely kind of amazing. And I think that's part of the kind of the seductive part of the use of you know, kind of big computerized systems. So things, I don't think at the stage that we actually took on the electronic system, I think the implications of people monitoring what was going on were completely, well, perhaps other people noticed it, but I think at that time we didn't really understand it. And then all of a sudden, Elsevier decided that we should actually receive a new publishing system. And so we kind of, in terms of functionality, this system seemed to be, as an editor, seemed to be worse than their previous system. So we kind of worried a lot about what was going on. What was being, why did they need this big new system when it wasn't as good as the last one? And one of the things that kind of struck us was that something that the publishers really kind of, I suppose, kept promoting was that it actually had a tool that would look for reviewers for us. And this was, I think, I don't know, because there, you know, could have been all kinds of other things going on, but this was one of the first kind of, I suppose, evidence that we had that they could have been using AI. And then, anyways, I have to say that this system was so awful that Elsevier actually decided to abandon it and almost revert back to the previous system with just a few other kind of things on it. But if you kind of then start to think about this, what Elsevier and all of the big, I mean, of course, nobody really does this paper system anymore, but what they can do is they can monitor like what editors are clicking on. So every single click that we do, all of the kind of like the background stuff, looking at what, you know, who we've got to review these papers, they can, all of that information can actually be like completely tracked and monitored. And the way that now with the new system that we have, they also have this, and this is something that's very kind of promoted, is this idea that we should pick, you know, that they would actually save us time by choosing the reviewers. I have to say, as an editor, probably of all the things that I do, choosing the best reviewers for a paper is absolutely 100% the most important part of my role. And the idea that there could be some kind of software there that's going to take over the decision for who should review the paper is actually kind of quite worrying. And the claim is that I'm biased when I select my reviewer and an AI system wouldn't be. And it's completely true. I know that I am biased. But of course, an AI system, which is, you know, fed up, you know, it's kind of algorithms and all of its information, of course, is also going to be biased. So the idea that you can get away with having a completely unbiased AI system to select reviewers is completely not true. And the kind of measures that they use, like all academics now, we kind of get something called an H indices. This is my kind of big overall ranking. Completely doesn't tell you about the quality of someone's work. I can honestly say that my rankings are not that bad. So it's not that I've got a bad ranking, I have kind of bad things to say for it. Okay, so the whole kind of I suppose capitalist interface with like the world of universities is that probably we pay for our research twice, in the sense that we pay for the academics' time and then we have to buy it back again. So it's almost like we don't get two for the price of one, we actually get one for the price of two. So this is actually, and it's very extremely expensive to buy journals, which means that really it's only in advanced capitalist countries that these journals can actually be kind of affordable. And I know that lots of the things that I write when I go to places like Africa, academics, their libraries just don't have access to the kind of resources that I have as an academic based in Edinburgh. So the big publishing companies now, they have started to say that they support open access, and the way that they support it is that you have to pay them a lot of money once your article is accepted to actually make it open access. And I know when I click on the link for my journal, with Critical Perspectives on Accounting, it actually, one of the things, it's like, we support open access and there's a price. And I looked at it yesterday to see how much it is. It's actually just over $4,000. So this is a huge amount of money to pay to make your work available throughout the world. Okay, so some universities have definitely started to work, and but this meeting, I think most people here are going to be worried about this stuff. So at Edinburgh, the university made a big decision to say that every single thing that's produced by anyone that works at Edinburgh is considered to be our copyright, not the universities, but the individual involved. And the way that things are kind of made more open is through a system called Pure. Pure is actually owned by Elsevier. So if the big publishing companies have monopoly over and the copyright to the vast majority of academic publications that are produced globally, even if we now stand up and say we're not going to give you copyright, they still have control over it, actually, in the UK at least, through the system called Pure. Okay, so I suppose the other implications for the clicking that I've said that I do, if I use Scopus, which is Elsevier-owned, a really good search engine, I have to say, it's kind of run by Elsevier. Of course, then they can tell exactly which articles I'm reading, I suppose which ones I'm downloading, the amount of data that they can collect, which actually turns out they can sell and is very valuable, is actually immense. Okay, so even as a journal editor, I also, I suppose, benefit from this. So every year we get a huge report. I mean, I don't know, about 80 pages long, that tells us, the most cited papers. It tells us the most downloaded papers. It tells us, where the readership are, and so on and so forth. And because academics are often now, I think I said they're assessed by this H index. So something that you can do to really improve your index is to get very high numbers of citations. So if you kind of understand the Elsevier kind of metrics, you can pick the areas that you would like to publish in, because you know that these are areas that mean that you're likely to be kind of highly cited. So the academic freedom that I spoke about at the beginning of this talk also is undermined by the kind of very data collection that the big kind of publishing companies collect, even if they're collected with the best will in the world, just to enable us to kind of understand what's going on and where the good areas are. There's a kind of like a push, I suppose, towards publishing in certain areas. Yeah, I think I've probably spoken for enough. So that's just the background to all of this.
Thank you so much, Dr. Cooper, for your incredible insight and sharing your experiences as an editor. It is now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Seeta Peña Gangadharan. Is an associate professor in the Department of Media and Communication at the London School of Economics, where she also serves as the Deputy Head of Department Research and Program Director for Media and Communications. Her work focuses on inclusion, exclusion, and marginalization, as well as questions around democracy, social justice, and technical governance. She currently co-leads 2 projects, Our Data Bodies, which examines the impact of data collection and data-driven technologies on members of marginalized communities in the US, and Justice, Equity, and Technology, which explores the impacts of data-driven technologies and infrastructures on European civil society. Thank you so much for being with us here today.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of my co-speakers, and also to Professor Cooper for bringing to light the politically economic context of publishing. And I think perhaps provoking questions about building new knowledge infrastructures that can help us achieve the types of information sharing and access to information, and ultimately to idea generation that we as researchers and as citizens of the world really look forward to. So if we could go to the first slide, a second slide. Yes, so very briefly, I'm going to try and divide up my time into 3 parts. So the first part, I want to represent some arguments that that have been shared by some legal and computer science scholars about the implications of cloud infrastructure and agile technologies on privacy and data protection. So I'm going to represent that work. They've been very influential on my own work, and I think it helps sort of provide the fundament for then thinking about the implications for literacy and the sort of nature of technological refusal in our current day and age. So I'm going to do that in the first few minutes. In the second few minutes, I'm going to take their arguments and I'm going to explain how their arguments about the changes to what we could call agile privacy impact literacy. And I think this is extremely important because it is one of the major policy solutions that we often turn to when thinking about how do we confront changes in technologies today. And third, I'm just going to talk very briefly about refusal, which is something that I think Thanos talked about or alluded to, and about implications more broadly. So slide 3, please. And can we increase the size of the slide, or maybe it's just my screen? Perfect, thank you. So in the work of Seeta Gerses and Joris van Hoboken, they've written this article, the reference of which is in the last or second to last slide on my deck. They've talked about the changes in the nature of software production today. And essentially, they describe a movement from a sort of planned development model. And this is an argument you can find in industry as well. People in industry will talk about this equally fluently, right? You've moved from a sort of model of software development from planned to one that is agile. And what that means is essentially, whereas previously in, say, the 80s or throughout the 90s, we often had a sort of physical object that we received our software on, this shrink-wrapped software, today we have what's known as services or service as architecture, which means that we can more dynamically access changes to any software application that's produced. The reason or the method or the process of this is, rather than a sequential manner of upgrading or improving or developing software, we now have this dynamic process that is often modularized. So in the era of planned development, we're dealing with often fixed physical items. And in agile software production, we're dealing with the cloud. And that has many implications for how we think about privacy and data protection, how we engineer those things or don't engineer those things. So one of the things that I want to just stress really briefly is that often, or one way that Gerses and Van Hoboken talk about this comparison between these different models of software development is to say, look, in this previous era, there was a codependence between teams developing software. And today, that's very different. And you can hear about this again in industry, where everything is sort of developed and improved and dynamically upgraded independently. So whereas you had in-house feedback happening, say in the 80s, 90s, since the 2000s, you could argue we're having feedback, and it's happening at the scale of internet usage. And what happens is, in this sort of cloud-based model of software production, you have bundled services that are sort of in a hierarchical manner delivered to you by developers or DevOps teams working on software development. Okay, so if we could go to the next slide. What Gerses and Van Hoboken say, and this is a quote, and I apologize, I don't have the page number for this quote from their article. They say, people are made complicit in the capturing and reorganization of their own behavior in the rapid development of software features. And another way of understanding that is all of this feedback that you give to developers in the process of using your software is sort of, you are the participating in the extraction of your own data for the collective optimization of software. We can move to the next slide. And I'm happy to take questions about that because I said that very quickly. But what this slide is, and if you don't mind maybe trying to just enlarge that as well, what this implies is that in agile privacy, you have a sort of hierarchy. Again, the developers, the DevOps providers are at the top. And you could argue that those that buy these off the shelf or services as architecture services, as well as the user, are sort of underneath that level, and they're at the mercy of the DevOps providers. Okay, next slide. So what that means, and this is the second part that I want to talk about briefly, is that the information flow model upon which we typically rely to teach people about privacy and data protection and how users can sort of avoid misuse or try and keep data flows under control is completely upended by agile software production. And this slide is actually a slide from a piece of curriculum that I helped co-develop on this website and project that I've put in the chat, the Data Privacy Project, which was a project with the Brooklyn Public Library, and which had expanded to eventually to Brooklyn Public Library, Queens, and New York libraries to really sort of educate library professionals about privacy and data protection within the library context. And this is a model this is sort of an activity that we would ask people to do, where we ask them to describe what happens when somebody visits a website at the library. And so the activities, it's kind of like a popular education activity where you're supposed to draw with your team what happens, and then it's a way to talk about both what people know and don't know, and where the threats in this information flow model might be. Now, this is fine in a sort of conventional internet, but in the current context where agile services predominate, this kind of information flow model doesn't apply, and partly that relates to the triangle and the hierarchy that I presented previously, right? There are lots of ways that information flows are being determined at the level of the cloud provider, at the level of infrastructure determined by the cloud service provider. That suggests that we have a lot to do when it comes to thinking about privacy literacy and how effective it might be to kind of continue to teach these conventional information flow models, and whether we can actually effectively leverage knowledge about how cloud service providers are determining forces, whether knowing that necessarily makes us better users, right? And so if you could move to the next slide. There's this great quote that came from Michael Veal, who's a lecturer at, I think, KCL, who was writing about the ways in which Apple and Google, for example, were incorporating privacy by design, privacy enhancing features during the early days of lockdown in the UK, and thinking about this tracking app. And in critiquing the efforts of providers to talk to the big providers sort of holding up their badge of privacy and privacy protection, said, those in control of computers, not those with large data sets, have the best visibility and the best and perhaps the scariest ability to change the world. Deflating digital power isn't just about governing data. It's the walls of the underlying systems we have to tear down. Very dramatic statement. I can appreciate it. But what he's trying to say is, look, even when we have privacy protecting features incorporated into our daily technologies, right, that doesn't necessarily take away the dimension of power that exists in these big providers. Next slide, please. I think I have about a minute left, and I want to use my time to say what this sort of, I guess in a way, the obsolescence of this kind of classic information flow model and the ways in which we typically think about educating people and encouraging privacy literacy really need to be rethought. A lot of people in industry sort of pride themselves on privacy by design, but we might want to question that and think about whether it's privacy by dicta and the extent to which the specific and constrained nature of privacy enhancing features implemented at the cloud level of cloud infrastructure or cloud service provision really do enough to give us the freedom to access information, to share information, and again, ultimately to generate new ideas. And the second area where I think we might need some creative thinking or rethinking is in this category of user responsibility. If the conventional model of information flow is upended by agile software production, the user is, I think, arguably no longer the locus of change, right? Something bigger needs to happen. And we might think about, in the very first instance, especially now that we have sort of commercially available AI technologies and quantum technologies coming down the pike, right? We might actually want to think about replacing user with a new name in order to help us think about what kind of conglomeration of, on the receiving end, what is that new category that helps us understand and conceptualize and ultimately enact a type of power that, again, gets us to the stage of accessing information, sharing information, and generating new knowledge in ways that I think we value in a world that respects human rights and civil rights. Thank you.
Thank you so much for your incredible insights and sharing your expertise with us today. It is now my pleasure to introduce Mr. Nick Shockey. Nick is the Director of Programs and Engagement at SPARC, where he has worked since 2009. Nick works across SPARC to identify areas to better support member libraries, co-leads SPARC's communities of practice related to negotiations and privacy and surveillance, manages SPARC's digital platforms, and leads SPARC's student and next generation focused initiatives, including OpenCon. Nick also contributes to SPARC's policy advocacy and landscape analysis work, including authoring SPARC's statements opposing Clarivate's acquisition of ProQuest, Elsevier's acquisition of Interfolio, and co-authoring SPARC's recent analysis of the privacy policies and practices of Elsevier's Science Direct platform. Thank you, Nick, for joining us today.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the introduction. And hopefully my slides are coming through clearly. If somebody could confirm, that would be wonderful. So it's great to be here with you all today, and I want to start by saying something that might be obvious, but research is in a period of transition. And when I say this, I imagine different changes may come to mind for different people. For many, this phrase probably brings to mind the shift towards open research, open access, open data, open source code, preprints, coming from an organization that's focused on making research open by default and equitable by design. That certainly does for me. Others might be thinking about the looming changes, as have already been mentioned, related to artificial intelligence, both positive and negative, and its deployment in the research process. Some others might be thinking about the continued consolidation of vendors that support key aspects of the research process, again, as has already been touched on. There's also another transition taking place that I suspect may not have come to mind for many or even most of the folks on this session today. And it's one that I will argue underlies and deeply impacts all of those that I just mentioned. That transition is the emergence of research platforms. By platforms, I'm referring to the suites of products and services offered by a single vendor across the full research lifecycle, from literature review and discovery to publication to research assessment and even faculty career management and university rankings. If you join the session today, you're likely familiar with many of these products individually, and you may use them on a regular or even daily basis, or have them used on you. Yet, when considered as a whole, the effects that an emerging research platform can have become much more than its individual parts. New and I'll argue urgent concerns arise. So to better understand what I mean by research platforms and the significant concerns they present, I'd like to talk through an example. So in 2018, two early career researchers at the University of Toronto Scarborough, Alejandro Posada and George Chan, advised by Leslie Chan, published this map of the academic knowledge production process, from research and discovery to publication to evaluation. Looking at this map, let's talk through a hypothetical example of how a company might collect and monetize data through products at different stages of this research process. Especially given the opacity of these products, again, as has already been mentioned, I want to emphasize this is a hypothetical, not necessarily what's happening right now. The advantages and opportunities presented by owning a leading discovery system for research articles is significant. As the owner, again, I believe as Christine mentioned, a company could access granular data about not only how much work is viewed, but by whom, what institutions they're from, and how they engage with the work. When the same company also owns a research analytics business, you can imagine the opportunity this could present to generate new metrics products for institutions to try to sell them on getting a competitive advantage through insights into early impact years before it's visible in citations. Who is reading an article and how they engage could be baked into these kinds of new metrics. And you can imagine a similar pitch by vendors to funders in both guiding their future grants and assessing current and past awards. If these kinds of new metrics become available, what impact does that then have on authors? If their institution or funder uses these products or might use these products in the future, could authors feel like they might be at a disadvantage if they publish with an outlet outside of that publisher/metric provider's ecosystem, or simply in an outlet that's not favored by them? Could these kinds of metrics then also potentially start to affect what kinds of research questions get asked? Could it push research even more towards the questions that will get the most attention or the most attention from leading individuals? If efforts like DORA succeed in the important work of eliminating journal-based metrics, these new kinds of metrics products risk replicating very similar problems, but without needing to rely on journals as a proxy for impact. Finally, being a platform owner provides an incredible degree of competitive advantage for a publishing business. For example, it allows you to use advanced insight into what emerging areas of research may be ready to support a journal by looking at data from, say, a discovery platform, and before your competitors are able to see that data, and to better identify and recruit new editors. So if a single vendor owns products with substantial adoption across these key stages of the research lifecycle that you can see in this graph, it creates a qualitative shift in the role that vendor can play. And this is where the term platform becomes apt. If a single vendor has significant influence over how individuals find and access information, over publications and the publication process, over research analytics and metrics, over faculty information systems and university rankings, the vendor should not be viewed as simply a service provider, but instead as an intermediary in the research process itself. As research platforms mature, it becomes increasingly difficult to avoid engaging with at least parts of them when conducting research, especially as some pieces such as analytics products and faculty information systems are largely out of individuals' control. The vendor's role then becomes much closer to that of other online platform businesses that you may be familiar with, such as Google, an intermediary between searchers and websites they may visit, or Amazon, an intermediary between consumers and products they may purchase. Particularly given the rightful scrutiny on these tech companies, we should carefully examine the potential for negative impacts of similarly structured businesses in the research environment, and whether they should be allowed to exist at all. So setting this hypothetical aside, I'd like to return to Posada and Chan's work. And in the next figure in the same paper, they actually overlaid this map of the knowledge production process with products offered by one vendor, Elsevier. So as you can see here, they found that there are relevant Elsevier products at nearly every stage in the knowledge production process. Since this article was published, the company has continued to make acquisitions, two of which I believe are significant enough to add here: ResearchFish for tracking research and evaluating impact, and Interfolio, a faculty information system that serves as enterprise software for a university to manage review, promotion, and tenure processes, often replacing local homegrown systems. I want to be clear here that I'm not implying that Elsevier is currently engaging in the actions in my earlier hypothetical. However, the fact that it is increasingly possible for one vendor to do so should be very carefully considered by the research community. These concerns are also not limited to one company, but apply to any vendor that owns products across different stages of the research process. These questions and concerns are what led us at SPARC to focus increasingly on privacy and to view it as essential to an equitable future for open research. A significant part of our initial work has focused on analyzing vendor privacy policies and practices, and these provide insight, or some insight, into what data is being collected, how it may be used, and by whom. The rise of research platforms requires data collection and sharing between different stages of the research process, again, as you can see here. Therefore, better understanding the policies governing data collection and use can provide insight into not only what may be happening now, but also what rights a company may be securing now in advance of potential new uses in the future. So published last November, our first vendor report that you can see here, which was authored by library privacy expert Becky Yos and myself, though primarily Becky, focuses on Elsevier's Science Direct product. Among its key findings were that user tracking that would be unthinkable in a physical library setting now happens routinely in publisher platforms. And that based on our analysis, Science Direct's data privacy practices directly conflict with library standards and guidelines. Specifically, the report documents, among other things, the use of web beacons, cookies, and other invasive web surveillance methods to track user behavior. And as you can see in one of the appendices, that this tracking is increasing over time, over the 2 years of our analysis. Also documented the extensive collection of a broad range of personal data combined with personal data harvested from other sources outside of Science Direct, the collection of personal data by external third parties through the site, and the disclosure of personal data to other Elsevier products and the potential for disclosure to other business units within RELX. And on this last point, the Science Direct's US Consumer Privacy Notice is particularly relevant and raises important concerns. The notice describes the disclosure both in the past and ongoing of detailed user data, including geolocation data, sensitive personal information, and inference data, both for wide-ranging internal use and to external third parties, including affiliates and joint venture partners. I want to be clear here that, again, this is not just one company. In an article that coined the term surveillance publisher, Jeff Pooley describes the rush by many other publishers to move in this direction of collecting and monetizing personal information. Furthermore, some leading research organizations have begun to call out the possible negative impacts of these platforms. The International Science Council has publicly stated the risks of science knowledge platforms, particularly if their governance is oriented towards private rather than public benefit. And the German Research Foundation has also directly called out the risks posed by research analytics products, specifically highlighting both the threat to academic freedom as well as the direct threat to researchers themselves in some instances. However, going back to Elsevier's case, this disclosure statement that I mentioned is particularly important to analyze in light of the larger data brokering business of Elsevier's corporate parent, RELX. As you can see here, RELX's largest division is now its risk business, sometimes referred to as LexisNexis, that provides data brokering and risk assessment products and services to a variety of buyers, including corporations like insurance companies, governments, and law enforcement agencies. And while I won't detail them all here, there have been many concerns raised about the use of these risk products, including investigations by congressional offices regarding the risks to citizens of governments and law enforcement agencies being permitted to purchase personal information they would otherwise need a search warrant to acquire in some cases. However, RELX is not alone as an academic vendor with a significant data brokering business. Thomson Reuters, owner of the legal research service Westlaw, also operates similar products brokering personal information, including a previous contract with U.S. Customs and Immigration Enforcement, ICE, to provide, quote, giant databases of personal information as characterized by the article you can see here, which was subsequently replaced by RELX. So while it would certainly be alarming if academically derived personal data was being passed to law enforcement agencies now, I want to be clear that our primary concern here is what is possible given the data collected and the policies and contracts by which it is governed. After all, it is routine for tech companies to collect data in one context, then later use it in another different context, often in ways that users would not have consented to originally. Fortunately, it's gonna get better. Fortunately, there are many opportunities to address the most significant risks posed by these platforms. There's an increasing drive to invest in non-commercial research infrastructure. The importance of such investments was highlighted in the UNESCO recommendation on open science that guides member states' approach to opening up research. And many academic institutions and libraries are beginning to look for more opportunities to make investments in non-commercial research infrastructure. There are also a variety of regulatory interventions that are possible to reduce privacy risks, such as preventing mergers that create and extend research platforms or blocking companies from simultaneously operating sensitive academic infrastructure alongside data brokering business. We at SPARC have been active on this front, opposing the mergers of Clarivate and ProQuest, as well as Elsevier and Interfolio, and urging agencies like the U.S. Federal Trade Commission and Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to take action. Collectively, we can also educate faculty, students, librarians, administrators, procurement officials, and other campus constituencies to make sure they're informed about decisions about what products to use and purchase, how to protect privacy, where to volunteer their labor and scholarship, and where they might want to get involved in advocacy campaigns. To this end, you might find the article Physical Equivalent Privacy by Dorothea Salo helpful, or want to use the resources also pictured here of the Library Freedom Project. SPARC's own privacy and surveillance community of practice will also be providing relevant resources for different campus constituencies. And I also want to mention 2 recently published books that may also be of interest: The Hank Show by Mackenzie Funk and Data Cartels by Sarah Lambden. And on the latter, I also want to acknowledge the significant impact that Sarah in particular has had in calling attention to the risks that arise when academic vendors simultaneously operate data brokering businesses. And I suspect there are a number of folks here today that either learned of these issues through Sarah's work or had their understanding sharpened by it. Libraries and institutions can also consider different purchasing decisions where a vendor's policies or practices don't align with institutional values. We're already beginning to see this in libraries, and as you can see in the resolution here, the Faculty Senate at the University of Wyoming has expressed explicit support for privacy as a key negotiating point for libraries and vendor negotiations, and SPARC will produce resources such as model contract language for privacy that can inform institutions' approach when negotiating more assertively for specific durable privacy protections. This past year also saw a number of high-profile editorial board resignations due to values differences with their commercial publisher, and I hope editorial boards will take these risks into consideration. And finally, the academic community is not alone in taking action in this space. In 2022, the British Columbia General Employees Union, led by Emma Pullman, was successful in organizing a shareholder campaign that pressured Thomson Reuters on the assessment of human rights risk on their data brokering products. BCG is also concerned with similar risk posed by other data brokers and is working with investors to begin to raise similar concerns with those companies. So in closing, ultimately, as the report notes, the practices documented in our analysis and that I've mentioned in this presentation here today raise the question of whether simultaneous ownership of key academic infrastructure alongside sophisticated surveillance and data brokering businesses should be permitted at all by users, by institutions, or by policymakers and regulatory authorities. And as these platforms continue to emerge, our response to them will deeply shape the future of research and whose interests are prioritized. Our decisions, individually and institutionally, will determine whether we must trade our privacy in exchange for access to knowledge or move toward a future where both rights are a reality to everyone. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nick, for sharing your research and your insights with us today. And now it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Dr. Nnenna Ifeanyi Ajufo. She is a professor of law and technology at the Leeds Law School at Leeds Beckett University, a technology and human rights fellow at Harvard's Carr Center for Human Rights Policy, and she has been an invited expert or appointed as a consultant by organizations such as the Chatham House, the Commonwealth, and the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. Her teaching and research interests focus primarily on the intersection of law and technology, especially the governance of digital technologies, digital rights, and the rule of law in cyberspace. She is the chair of the Cybercrime Working Group of the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise, vice chairperson of the African Union Cybersecurity Experts Group, and has been actively involved in advising the African Union Commission and African member states on existing international, regional, and national legal frameworks related to cybersecurity, as well as promoting cybersecurity in the region. I would be remiss if I did not also mention that she serves as an African Union delegate to the United Nations Ad Hoc Committee to elaborate a comprehensive international convention on countering the use of information and communications technologies for criminal purposes. Thank you so much for joining us here today.
Thank you so much, Meg. Thank you for inviting me, but particularly I also want to thank Professor Cooper, Seeta, and Nick for actually setting the pace in this conversation and highlighting all the very important parts of the conversation. And I think it's interesting to see how the actors, the various actors involved in this discourse operate, and to see how the triangulation of these diverse actors produce patterns of data infringement infringement and breaches of privacy for data subjects on publishing platforms. I would not want to go into most of the comments because of time, but I would like to speak about the legal standards, speak like an academic myself who has been publishing, but also look at the legal standards in law and how to hold certain platforms accountable, if at all. Now, as an academic in the first instance, there's usually this assumption that relates to the independence of academic institutions vis-a-vis independence of academic publishing platforms. So we tend to think that because academic institutions are independent and devoid of political interest, it is usually the same for academic publishing platforms. There are no political interests. And thanks to Professor Cooper, who pointed out the fact that there are commercial interests, Nick also said, did the same. We must remember that scholarly platforms are owned by businesses, and you cannot extricate them from the usual data economy, which means that they have obligations, they have responsibilities, even from the basis of government expectations. And so just like other commercial platforms, they are wired based on a particular kind of business model. And that means that there are key policy issues here. First of all, now you find that there's the vulnerability of researchers like me, forgetting that I have a legal background. Sometimes the thinking is that data collection is justified just because it's an academic platform, and that is flawed. I hear colleagues say things like, if the data is being used for educational purposes, then it is justified. If the intention is to use my data to create better programs or better educational tools, then it is fine. But then just like Nick pointed out, you see that information that is collected is being used for other purposes. And so people tend to think if it's not biometric, then there is no problem. And it's sometimes amusing when you see academics think that email addresses, university affiliation, websites, ORCID IDs, email addresses are not sensitive information. And so just because of that, there is no concern. Another issue, like Professor Cooper pointed out, is the fact that the demands of publishing has changed. And I find myself lacking the freedom of choice. The fact that platforms collect my name, my email address, sometimes my LinkedIn profile, just to allow me publish on a platform. Nobody is questioning the surveillance or cyber criminal aspects. In such instance, I want to be relevant in academia. There are the pressures of academic bodies, universities wanting open source publication, research funding bodies wanting visibility, and as an academic, I am torn between deciding where to publish my work or risk the possibility of obscurity of my research. So on one hand, like Professor Cooper pointed out, the freedom of choice is an issue, and to what extent that would be regulated is also a concern, because it means, I ask, does it mean that academic institutions are also culpable in such instances? Now, Thanos also pointed out the fact that the ability of these libraries or academic platforms are constrained. So the second issue here is, do governments regard such platforms as intermediaries? Outside of the basic business model, if governments regard academic platforms, publishing platforms as intermediaries, it means that in cases of public emergency, criminal investigation, national security, they can rightly, under the law, be mandated to keep information, and such information can be requested. So in extension, we begin to question the agency of surveillance from such platforms, data sharing, spying, surveillance, and this idea is not far-fetched if you look at the concept of surveillance capitalism, which Shoshana Zuboff from Harvard describes. She describes it as an economic system that is built on the secret extraction and manipulation of human data, and it has become common coinage that captures consumers, increasing awareness that their data is bought, sold, and used without their consent. The third consideration is, and I saw a question on the chat, what are the standards? How do data protection laws apply to this platform? We see the continued convergence of consumers, governments, and market forces beginning to give more control. So sometimes we think it's all bad, but then we are being given control as to how data about us is generated and how we can also reduce the free harvesting of data. Now, clearly, on terms of the law, the right to data protection is enshrined on the mandate that the processing of personal data must rest on consent. That is the first basis of such a mandate. It must rest on consent of users, and it must be for specified purposes. So market practice, as we've all elaborated on, is different. What the law says is actually different. It rests on consent, and it must be for specified purposes. And the individual who is the data subject has rights of access and rectification. And I'll talk about the GDPR, for example, the General Data Protection Rules of Europe, which recognizes that unrestricted collection, processing, and sharing will impact people's private lives. So under the GDPR, as an academic on a platform, as someone whose data is being collected on even a scholarship platform, I have the right to be informed. I have the right of access. I have the right of rectification. I have the right to erasure. I have the right to restrict processing. I have the right to data portability. And even when it is on the grounds of marketing, I have a right anytime to reject that my personal data would be processed for direct marketing purposes. I have a right to object to the processing of my data for such marketing. I can preclude the profiling of my data. And once I object, such data processing should not happen. It is a question of implementation and enforcement. On the other hand, while I have this right, the data company, the data publishing firm, also has an obligation to mirror that right. And to break it down, they have a right to inform me. They have a right to grant me access. They also have the obligation for technical means to enable my privacy. So, which means privacy by design is actually a standard by law. They have the obligation to ensure through technical means that I have data privacy. Also, they have to ensure procedural and organizational rules to safeguard this right. And what does this mean? They must undertake privacy impact assessments. They must employ, for example, data protection officers. They must look at data protection by design. They also have an obligation to be accountable for fulfilling these obligations, which means they must be able to demonstrate compliance and to even notify government or the regulatory bodies of any data breaches, if any. So these obligations bind public actors, for example, the libraries, as well as the private actors, the scholarly publishing platforms. Like I said, these laws are there. It's not that they are not there. It's not that the governments are not doing anything. However, it is usually a question of implementation and monitoring. The other thing to remind us, if I'm to play the devil's advocate in this conversation, is that data protection privacy rights are not absolute rights. Remember, the right to data protection can also be set aside. But the problem is when there is indiscriminate or mass surveillance, for example, like Nick pointed out, tracking, such interference must be with a legitimate purpose, and it must be in accordance with the law. So by law, public authorities can even interfere with some of these rights through calling out public publishing platforms, academic platforms, where there is national security concerns, or if it is for the economic well-being of the country. So the question again is, what is data being collected for? In what instances? Is it for health? Is it for morals? Is it for the protection of freedom of others? So that privacy involves a protected sphere in which individuals can freely construct their own identities, but in consonance with societal standards. Again, if you look at the GDPR, for example, in terms of research purposes, you find that the right to data protection is precluded when data is being processed for research purposes, and this you would find commonly in many national legislations. So if you look at Article 29 of the GDPR, it makes provisions, for example, for processing for archiving purposes, in public interest, if it is scientific or historical research purposes, or statistical purposes. In such instances, data protection can happen subject to appropriate safeguard. Now, the question then is, what are these safeguards? By virtue of the law, such safeguards shall ensure that the technical and organizational measures are in place to ensure respect for the principle of data minimization. Again, these are all legal issues that would have to be interpreted in courts. And of course, it could involve any measure like pseudonymization. Now, where personal data is processed for scientific or historical purposes or statistical purposes, the law can allow. States, nations can allow for derogation from these rights, as long as it's on the standards of law, legitimacy, proportionality, and necessity. So we need to have that at the back of our minds. Again, like I said, it's a question of boundaries, it's a question of standards, it's a question of implementation. And while these rules are clear, ethical standards are still lacking and there are still challenges in enforcement. So what is the approach? Now, Professor Cooper talked about Africa, for example. We find that there are regions where data protection laws are not necessarily being respected. There are places where there are no data protection laws. What is the best approach? Sometimes there is a question of formality of regulations. Regulations on paper do not necessarily address issues all the time. And there are questions of, should it be rather on a basis of corporate social responsibility? Can ethical norms bring results rather than stringent binding obligations that may not actually be respected? Should obligations be voluntary rather than binding? And I think a good place to start is going back to the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights. Now, one of the things I've seen, for example, is the BTEC project of the OCHR. The BTEC project is trying to imply and apply the United Nations guiding principles on business and human rights in the area of technology and for tech firms. And there are key issues in terms of looking at human rights risk in business models, such as due diligence, end-use priority, accountability, and remedy, and all kinds of mixtures of measures that looks at exploring regulatory policy responses based on a human rights approach. Now, again, it still leaves a gap in terms of, are we being rhetorical in terms of human rights standards? How do we enforce these obligations? Such efforts also allow us to think about codes of conduct that are sector specific. Do we look at a multi-stakeholder approach, like Thanos pointed out when he gave the introductory speech? Would that allow us sort of underscore principles? But I would say that whatever approach we take, whatever basis we take, it must be standards that imply transparency, accountability, and of course, an approach that underscores humanity and must put people first ahead of business interest. Research is good. Knowledge sharing is good, and that should be prioritized on the basis of humanity and take away the challenge of, when I publish, I am rather scared about what happens to my data. Academic platforms should also, of course, collect only information that is necessary, and I know that this point has been made. And importantly, Thanos pointed out about third-party companies. I think it's important that academic platforms are transparent related to the proprietary systems that process, scope, and use data collection and analyze them. These are information that I don't know as an academic, and I think it should be clear in plain language, communicated clearly to researchers as to how they can review, change, and opt out of data collection. I am a proponent of privacy by design, and if you look at Stanford University's model, there are these 5 stages of design thinking. It usually starts out with empathy, and I think that gives companies a basis because, for example, it is right that I am privacy literate, but being privacy literate doesn't necessarily mean that privacy, I would be given the right to self-determine my privacy if platforms are not privacy friendly or not privacy compliant. So I may have the right knowledge, but the tools may not measure up to the knowledge that I have. And so having that at the back of our minds at the level of designing would imply that privacy and data protection is used as a basis for defining interface. Now, I would end shortly because of time. Again, the transition towards open science, open source is a cultural change. You see, for example, again, Professor Cooper talking about what you have in Africa. Now, it means that it involves the development of new policies, new strategies, and the evaluation of outputs that work against open criteria. And to realize these changes, we need trust, we need collaboration, and we need commitment from tech companies and even from governments across the globe who would regulate and monitor compliance. So it is important that we develop clear guidelines for what we want as standards of ethical protection in publishing. Community engagement with researchers, funders, and institutions, and mainly, like Thanos said, of course, multi-stakeholder approach. Recently, as part of commitments towards the Summit of the Future, which will happen in September 2024, the UN Secretary General submitted one of his policy briefs on information integrity on digital platforms, and it is clear that digital platforms must be integral players in the drive to uphold information integrity. And when you have these conversations, you invite tech platforms. We usually don't invite scholarly academic platforms. Like I said, they are not usually regarded as part of the business model for the data economy. That has to change. And I'll end by saying that as we prepare for the Summit of the Future in 2024, we have seen various states and regions that are submitting contributions towards the development of the UN Global Digital Compact. I think the Global Digital Compact is expected when it comes out to outline shared principles for an open, free, and secure digital future for all. And part of the Common Agenda report suggests that some of the issues that will be covered will include options as to how data is being used, how people can control that, application of human rights online, and particularly promoting a trustworthy internet by introducing accountability criteria for online content. And that mirrors most of the conclusions of the other panelists approaching human rights to underscore these issues that we've discussed. So I look forward to the summit in 2024, and I hope we can have a more strategic approach to getting actors involved in terms of accountability and transparency for data protection and privacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all of our speakers today for your incredibly rich contributions to this discussion. I'm going to bring everybody in as we enter into a brief Q&A period. So I really want to thank everyone again. And to pick up on one of your comments, Nnenna, as you said, this past June of 2023, the Secretary General released a policy brief on information integrity on digital platforms, which talks about the importance of integrating user privacy and security into all new technologies and products from the outset. That digital platforms should ensure meaningful transparency regarding algorithms and data. And so I would suggest for all of our panelists, from your perspective, what does it mean for a platform to provide meaningful transparency?
Now, I think when we think of transparency, literally, it gives this sort of openness, accountability in that sense of the word. But then when you begin to look at obligations, and particularly for data protection, it becomes dynamic. It becomes a fluid concept. And in practical terms, and I'll start from a basic term because we have a huge audience. I think first, it starts from the terms and conditions you find on these platforms. The lengthy terms and conditions. Professor Cooper talked about the levels you find before you're able to publish. On the basic term, what are the terms and conditions? Is it putting people first? Secondly, are you telling me what my data will be used for? As an academic, when I sign up to a university, I am told what information I do, some trainings, information data trainings. It tells me how I must respect a student's data as an academic. But the institution doesn't also tell me in using the school library what the obligations of the library is to me. Okay, so what are those dynamics? And that is why I said from the onset is because we do not regard academic platforms or libraries as being intertwined in the data economy. We see them as independent just because they're affiliated to universities and what have you. So in the first instance, I should be told. I think that is transparency. I should also be reminded, I know these things, Meg, because I'm a lawyer. I know that I have a right to object, but if I were to take a poll across participants here, people do not really know that I have a right to object. I have a right to consent. I have a right to withdraw my consent at any time. And that should place platforms as a place of educators. Seeta talked about privacy literacy, and that is very key. These are languages we don't even use in the right places. So privacy literacy means putting platforms in a place of responsibility and a place of obligation. Thirdly, and which is something Thanos pointed out, transparency. Most times you find that the scholarly platforms have third-party obligations, people who allow them to be hosted, who provide the commercial, basis for the businesses. For example, I may not know, again, I believe this is Chatham House rule, I may not know who Jeff Bezos, for example, is sponsoring, even though it's an academic platform, but I will want to know, because I would believe that the market interest of that platform may be tied to a bigger person somewhere and his own model or his own dynamics. If I'm subscribed to the UN library, I want to know the model of the UN. What do they do? What are their beliefs? What are their main mission and vision? So those sort of transparency would also help. There are also interests of editors, publishers. Most platforms do not tell you what is involved. That would then not help me decide if this person's data rules or ethics rather will favor me. So, those are some of the little very practical of transparency. Again, transparency means compliance to government. Do you return to government compliance? Some organizations don't even know what you're talking about. Places like let's not assume that the global south understands these conversations. There are also other parts. So I think compliance as well is a very key issue for transparency and being willing to be held liable in those instances. Thank you.
Can I just add really quickly? I know that we're out of time, but I just wanted to say something as someone who's been sort of engaged in privacy and data protection debates for almost 15 years now. I find that transparency and platforms extremely important issue. What's happened in part because of a compliance culture that has evolved around data protection regulations is that some of the most powerful providers are the most transparent, and yet they still don't give us the service or treat us as individuals or as groups as we would like to be treated. So I think there's a lot of important rethinking to be done on how we interpret and measure transparency. If I were an organizational sociologist, I might say, hey, actually, it might be significant that X has a very tiny, and it's a commercial platform, not a research platform, but has a minuscule sized policy department in relation to the rest of its full-time employees, right? That says something. So yeah, we see a lot of reporting, transparency reporting, compliance, sort of meeting the metrics, but not necessarily demonstrating the logic or good intent behind changes. And that's really problematic.
Briefly, because I know we're really out of time, there are sort of two other points that I'd add here, echoing my co-panelists. One is that I think transparency has to be human readable. It has to be provided in a way that is meaningful to an average person, not a lawyer. Transparency can be achieved in ways that are kind of weaponized actually against the average user. If you look at page 16 of our Science Direct report, it maps out the webs of multiple different policies that you would have to read and understand that are all subject to change, that dictate what data is collected, how it's used. And the second is that I think transparency is important, but it's sort of necessary but not sufficient, right? Transparency is not a substitute for just not collecting certain types of data at all, or being very direct in contractually binding ways that you might collect this data, but it will not be shared or reused in any other ways other than specific ones that are documented in things like contracts or terms that can't be changed unilaterally by a vendor like privacy policies can.
Yes, very much so. And then that, of course, moves into the area of compliance. I want to give us an opportunity. Yes.
Just a quick note that we need to be mindful of the transparency washing as well. So there is transparency, which is extremely important, but I wanted to build on your points. I mean, you are the experts. I'm not the expert on this, but I have noticed, and we have noticed that, as there is some blue washing, some SDG washing, I have the feeling sometimes that we're also gearing towards transparency washing as well. And I would also opt for a transparency that is clear and understood by all the users that enter the library, whether that is a public library or the United Nations headquarters library or any library around from the 2 million plus libraries around the world. Sorry for the time.
Not at all. It's a very important point. I realize we're at time. I do want to give us an opportunity for one more question from the chat. So if we move outside of the increasingly consolidated sector of academic publishing and start to think about what non-commercial research infrastructure would look like, in order for that non-commercial research infrastructure to thrive, how can it when dependence on compute is only increasing? And this was a question specifically for Nick, but I would welcome a response from any of our panelists.
Yeah, I'll try to answer briefly. I mean, I think it, in my mind, speaks to the importance of intentional investments in non-commercial or at least community-minded infrastructure. As the UNESCO recommendations, highlights at multiple points. That if we want, a privacy-preserving future, it's important to be intentional, both, at the government level about what investments governments make in the public interest, to have research infrastructure that's aligned with that public interest. I mean, a huge number of writers, are owned by governments. It's possible that they can provide the kinds of support that are necessary as compute demand increases. But there's also a huge role for institutions to play to, again, be very intentional about what platforms they're supporting, looking for investments they might be able to make with other institutions, to create that infrastructure that's necessary, that's sort of growing along with the compute demands that are necessary as research evolves. So I think it's possible, but we have to pursue it intentionally, and not just sort of rely on commercial interests that will, shape the way that those resources is deployed, in what's in their best interest rather than what's in the public interest.
That was my question, by the way.
Thank you so much for that question, for the response. I, again, want to extend my thanks to the team of the Dog-Hammarskjöld Library for all of their support in providing a space for this conversation today, and to each of our expert panelists for the work that you do and the time that you've given to us today in addressing these very important conversations related to human rights, privacy, freedom of expression, freedom of access to information, and how that intersects with the current state of the academic publishing industry. So thank you, and we look forward to continuing these conversations thanks to the engagement, the deep engagement of our audience today. We look forward to seeing you soon. Bye.